In the heart of a brutal winter, a 12-year-old farm boy wandered past the frozen riverbank, hoping to catch something in his traps before nightfall. But instead he found a wounded native girl, barely alive, lying in the snow. Her body was bruised, her dress torn, and she was too weak to speak. Most would have run. Helping her meant freezing to death himself. But he didn't think twice. He took off his only blanket, his last connection to his lost father, and wrapped it around her trembling body. What he didn't know was she was the chief's granddaughter, and by morning, 700 warriors were standing outside his barn. What happened next changed everything. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? The winter river whispered death beneath its frozen skin as 12-year-old Jacob Carter trudged through the thickets near the tree line, his patched boots soaked from snowmelt, his breath sharp in the icy morning that had no mercy for the poor or the forgotten. It was supposed to be a simple chore: check the trap lines before noon and be home before dark. But the boy's life, already carved from loneliness since the scarlet fever took his mother and the war swallowed his father, turned into something he could never have imagined when he spotted the smear of blood in the snow, bright as berries in winter, trailing to a collapsed figure near the bank. The girl lying half-curled as if trying to hold her soul inside, her dark hair matted with ice, a woven dress torn and bloodied at the side, and he hesitated for only a second, just a heartbeat, before running to her because the part of him that remembered his mother's stories, about kindness as resistance and courage as a choice, could not walk past another dying person. She was native, he could tell, though he didn't know from which tribe. Only that her breath came in wet rattles and her hand trembled when he touched it, eyes fluttering beneath bruised lids. And though he'd been raised on tales of Indian raids and war cries in the night, he saw no threat here, only someone about to die alone, like his little sister had. And something inside him screamed, no, not again. So he yanked the heavy wool blanket from his back, the last thing his father ever gave him before vanishing into war, and wrapped it around her shaking body, tucking it beneath her shoulders like his mother used to do for him, whispering, "You're safe now," even as he knew she wasn't. Not yet. And then sat with her, not caring about frostbite or time, waiting for her to wake or for death to come. But instead came silence, deep, watchful, thick with the pressure of unseen eyes. And when he finally looked up from her face, he saw them one by one stepping from the trees like shadows becoming flesh, warriors with painted faces and long braids and eyes that burned like coals, horses stamping at the forest's edge, boughs held loose but ready, tomahawks glinting at their sides, and Jacob's blood turned to ice, certain he'd be mistaken for a raider or a captor. But instead the lead warrior, old or tall, his hair threaded with white, looked not at Jacob but at the girl, and something passed across his face, grief, recognition, disbelief before he nodded once, a gesture not of threat but of honor, and lifted his hand in silent salute, followed by hundreds of warriors behind him, rising from every shadow, lining the riverbank like spirits returned to judge the living, 700 strong, all bearing witness to one boy's defiance of hate. And Jacob, unable to speak, simply bowed his head, heart pounding, until the elder rode forward, dismounted with care, knelt beside the girl, and placed a hand on her forehead, murmuring words in a language Jacob didn't understand but felt down to his bones. And only then did the warriors move, forming a protective circle, lifting her onto a horse with reverence, beckoning Jacob to follow, and he did, not because he was forced, but because something had cracked open inside him, a purpose, a tether, a need, and over days they traveled through forest and snow, feeding him, watching him, never speaking in English but never threatening either, until they reached the hidden village nestled in a mountain hollow where drums beat like heartbeats and smoke curled into the sky like prayers. And there she was, laid in a tent woven with symbols, her wounds cleaned with crushed herbs, her breathing steadier but still faint. and he stayed at her side always, sleeping on the ground, accepting food with whispered thanks, earning slow, careful smiles from children and suspicious glares from warriors who had buried brothers and sons to men with his skin. And in the nights the elder, named White Elk, told him of the girl Awanita, granddaughter of the chief, lost during a settler raid 2 nights prior, assumed dead or worse, and how Jacob's act had shaken the council's belief that all white men were poison. And slowly Jacob began to learn, not just language but history, pain, betrayal, resilience, how treaties were broken like dry sticks, how children were taken to schools that beat their names from their mouths, how fire had devoured whole villages while soldiers laughed, and each truth struck him like a stone, until the weight of his ancestors' sins felt unbearable. But Awanita woke one morning, eyes soft, voice raw, and whispered, "You stayed." And in those 2 words Jacob felt redemption begin. Not complete, never earned, but begun. And as spring thawed the snow, he stayed, learned, helped, built traps and chopped wood and played with children. And over weeks Awanita walked again, her steps slow but steady, always with Jacob beside her, and when she smiled it felt like sunlight returning to a sky long dark. And the tribe, once wary, began to accept him, not as blood but as heart. And then came the day he heard distant gunfire and saw smoke rising over the far ridge, and scouts returned breathless with news. Settlers were coming, claiming the tribe had taken a white boy, demanding his return, and the council debated in heated voices, some urging to send him back, others ready to fight. But Jacob stood before them all, voice shaking, and said he would go, not to surrender but to speak, to beg them to see what he saw. And White Elk placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then you go as one of us," and gave him his own son's necklace. And so Jacob rode alone to the settler line, heart pounding, where rifles were drawn and shouts filled the air, and he yelled over the noise that he was not kidnapped, that the tribe had saved him, that the girl they left to die was alive because of them. And at first they didn't believe him, called him brainwashed, savage-loving traitor. But one man listened, Sheriff Dalton, whose own son had died lost in a blizzard because no one had stopped to help him. And that man told the others to lower their guns, and talks began, and days passed, and while not everyone agreed, a line of peace was drawn, and Jacob returned to the village carrying hope like fire in his chest. And that night around the great fire, Awanita danced, slow at first, then with growing strength, and Jacob watched her, heart thudding, and when she reached for his hand he took it, and the elder smiled, and drums beat until stars faded into dawn. But peace is fragile, and the next year, a different group of settlers rode in with no patience for treaties or tales, and they struck in the night, burning tents, killing warriors in their sleep, and Jacob, now taller, leaner, scarred from a wolf attack the previous winter, fought with everything he had, dragging children from flames, swinging an axe until his arms bled. And when he saw Awanita cornered by a man with a pistol, he leapt between them, taking a bullet in the shoulder that spun him to the ground, but he rose, staggered, roared, and tackled the man into the fire, saving her again. And when the dust settled, many were dead, but the tribe stood victorious, and in the ashes they buried the lost and rebuilt. And Jacob, shoulder-bound, feverish, woke days later with Awanita's hand in his, her tears on his cheek, and she whispered, "I won't lose you too." And he smiled through pain and said, "Not today." And years passed, and the boy became a man, his skin still pale but his soul carved with symbols, his voice fluent in the tongue of warriors. And when the old chief died, White Elk made Jacob speaker for the tribe in trade councils. And he stood before governors and generals and told them the truth. Unwavering, unafraid, and beside him always was Awanita, her hand in his, their child slung at her hip. And though prejudice never vanished, though some still spat when they walked through town, many listened, many changed, and one summer, 20 years after that frozen morning by the river, Jacob found the old blanket folded in a box, faded and torn, and gave it to his daughter, telling her, "This saved her life and mine," and she clutched it with wide eyes. And the story lived on, and somewhere in the woods, under the trees that once watched a boy kneel beside a dying girl, the wind whispered not of death but of legacy.